So the topic I'm going to talk about today is foreign workers, immigrants, and economic growth. I'm going to start by first asking you, to think about several questions. One is, how many of you, what do you guys think about when you hear the word foreigner, for example? Does anyone have anything you want to say, to share? Foreigners, what does it mean? Okay, the next question you want to think about. How many of you, when you graduate and when you start joining the workforce in maybe, you're JC1 now, and maybe 5-6 years' time, want to be a cleaner, a garbage collector, a waitress or waiter? Anyone? Show of hands. Are those the top choices on your list of occupations? I don't think so, right? 10 years from now, when you guys are working adults, what kind of society do you want to be living in? What will your neighbors look like? What will they sound like? What skin color will they be? Where will their countries of origin be? These are questions that I want you guys to think about because they will impact you directly and the country, and the policies and the issues that I'm going to discuss today will shape that future 10 years from now. So first, let me show you some examples of what we call foreign workers and immigrants, right? The guy on the top left is someone I've interviewed several times. He's the CEO of Standard Chartered Singapore. His name is Ray Ferguson. Country of origin, Scotland. He's currently Singaporean. The woman on the bottom, I don't know her name, but she's a Chinese PRC immigrant, new citizen of Singapore with her daughter. So I guess her daughter will eventually be entering school with other Singaporeans. The guy on the right with the yellow shiny hard cap, he's an Indian national working in construction at an offshore and marine construction site. He is also a foreign worker. So broadly, I would divide, when we talk about foreigners, I would say broadly there's the migrant worker who is generally low-skilled and earning lower wages. And then you have the so-called foreign talent, which the government has termed it before, more skilled, more educated, earning a higher salary, who's also a foreigner and eventually possibly will become a PR or a citizen, a new immigrant. So what do you think about? These are some of the comments I've heard and read online when we talk about foreigners and foreign workers. They're rude, noisy, they sound different. They're depressing our wages. I don't know if any of your parents or friends of parents' friends have mentioned this when they talk about foreigners. They're overcrowding the MRT and the buses. They're taking our jobs. Pretty negative comments. But there's another side to this conversation. This is what SME bosses say. We can't find enough Singaporeans to do the jobs that we've created. Singaporeans don't have the right skills for these jobs. Foreign workers work harder. It's subjective, right? But it's also an opinion that SME bosses have told us when we interview them. So why are we even having this conversation? What has happened in Singapore to create perceived animosity towards foreigners? Why do we even want foreigners with us, and what do they contribute to our society and economy? Broadly, I'd say the debate over foreigners and immigrants is a new one. Since Singapore's independence in 1965, because of population issues, because we wanted to grow our economy rapidly, from the third world country it was, we opened the doors to foreign workers and foreigners in the 60s and 70s. This is when we attracted millions of dollars of investments from, manufacturing, electronics companies, petrochemicals companies, and we needed people to work in these jobs. Between 1974 and 1982, the foreigner population in Singapore doubled from 46,000 to 100,000. And because of that, the Singapore government started to introduce a levy and quota system to control the inflow of foreigners. But the prevailing thought since the 60s and 70s was always that foreigners are good for Singapore. We need foreign workers, we need immigrants in order to drive economic growth. And with economic growth, we can all have a better life. So the story of economic miracle, the story of from third world to first world, this all had something to do with the amount of foreign workers we let in. So this hasn't changed. And what are the factors, driving foreign worker growth in Singapore? Broadly, three factors: globalization, our fertility rate, and also growth. The desire for growth, I'd say. So globalization, as you guys know, I'm sure you studied during your GP and economics classes. Globalization in the 90s and early part of the 21st century has seen borders, opening, the mobility of labor increasing substantially. And because of the rise of China since they joined the WTO in the early part of the decade, it's really driven global trade and unleashed, I would say, a flood of sort of low-wage Indian and Chinese laborers into the global market, competing for jobs, and basically going into countries, U.S., Europe, Singapore as well. At the same time, Singapore has always tried to upgrade its economy, moving from low-cost manufacturing and low-skilled manufacturing to more higher value-added manufacturing, which requires more sophisticated skills. And in the process, during this transition, in order to stay competitive, Singapore didn't have enough skilled workers for these jobs. And there were a lot of manufacturing firms that wanted to set up here, and which Singapore wanted to attract into the economy as well. So what happened? We had to bring in, again, skilled foreign workers to fill up these jobs. So that's globalization. It was a huge factor for many countries in basically opening their doors to foreign labor. The second aspect, which is a bit more unique to Singapore, especially, is that we've had a very, very low fertility rate. I say unique. I mean, it's not really unique because a lot of developed countries, the phenomenon is the richer you become, for some reason, couples want to have fewer babies, right? And we've basically had a problem. Our fertility rate has dropped consistently to what is now 1.2, which is well below the replacement rate of about 2.1. So we're not creating enough people to replace our own. We're not creating enough Singaporeans. We're not sending enough Singaporeans into the workforce each year to fill up the jobs that are being created because of companies coming here and because of companies expanding in the region. So one article I read recently that was written in the Straits Times is that our country now is at a demographic turning point. The baby boom generation of about 900,000 workers will start to turn 65 this year, which means they'll be exiting our workforce. We have 900,000 people who will be leaving the workforce. Do we have enough Singaporeans entering the workforce? That means you guys coming into the workforce to replace these people. It will only take 8 more years for Singapore to reach a point where more citizens stop work than start work each year. This is according to the National Population and Talent Division. Think about that. In 8 years, if we don't have any foreigners, there will be more people who are retiring and needing pensions and social security and more healthcare than there are people entering the workforce and making money to support these older people. Okay? That's a fundamental and very significant challenge for Singapore. And the third point, which has been quite controversial to Singapore, has been this pursuit of growth. In the past 10 years, I'd say, since the early 2000s, Singapore has grown at a very rapid rate. If you don't look at even when we've had recessions, we've bounced back very strongly. And if you just look at the economic growth rate in 2010, right after the global financial crisis has struck in 2009, we grew 14.7%, which is, on par with African developing countries, right, which are nowhere near the kind of country we are. But we were growing at that pace. And so it led to economists questioning whether this growth was actually being shared, by all Singaporeans, or whether it was just looking good at the top headline numbers, but not really being distributed well into the economy. So one of the MPs, Inderjit Singh, who is in Ang Mo Kio GRC, he called it a pursuit of growth at all cost. That means he thought the government was doing whatever it could just for growth itself, right? Growth for growth's sake itself. Another economist, Linda Lim, who is at the University of Michigan, she called it growth fetishism. Fetishism. There was a scary desire to just have growth, right? Whatever the consequences. Of course, the government denied it, right? They said the growth policy was never to maximize growth for growth itself, but, in order to raise wages, create good jobs for Singaporeans. So that has been a point of contention. And one reason why they did that is because, if you remember, you may be too young to remember this, in 1997, I guess you guys were pretty young, we had a huge Asian financial crisis. Unemployment here soared. A lot of my parents' friends, for example, in Singapore, were out of jobs. The housing market crashed, eroding a huge chunk of their wealth. In the year 2000, as the economy was struggling to recover, the U.S. technology bubble burst. There was this huge dot-com surge. All these tech companies were being created, and the stock markets were running up. And then it suddenly burst. And again, there was a huge drop in economic growth in the U.S., which affected Singapore because we export to them. And then right after that, 2001, 9/11 struck. Again, bringing a shock to the U.S. system, affecting Singapore. And then just 2003, there was a SARS crisis that hit in Asia. Singapore basically almost shut down. And again, our economy was in the doldrums, right? So the government was struggling to think of a way to grow the economy. Unemployment was rising. There was the risk that foreign companies no longer saw Singapore as attractive to set up shop here. So what were they going to do? So they decided to pursue new sectors of growth, and one of them was the integrated resorts, which I think you guys are quite familiar with now. Is that tall building with a spaceship on top, right? And they also welcomed, expansions in petrochemicals. Shell and ExxonMobil invested, I think, in total almost $10 billion into the Singapore economy. Manufacturing, they opened a new sector in pharmaceuticals. Bio, if you remember, I think 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of my friends were told that they should enter into the biomedical sciences industry because that was going to be the next big thing. Okay, I don't know how that has worked out. So all these sectors were growing. And how is the Singapore going to basically support this growth? So the government said we need foreign workers, we need foreign labor to come in, whether they're skilled or unskilled, to take up the jobs and to support whatever jobs Singaporeans weren't doing or didn't want to do, so that Singaporeans could also benefit from the growth and have other jobs. So since 2003, we've had dramatic growth over the past 9-10 years. I think we grew an average of 6 to 7% each year. Okay. This was the prevailing thought of the government at that time. If you read, this is what then Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong was saying in 1997. If you look at the bottom, the last two sentences, it's about foreign workers, right? Singaporeans have accepted them. We need to continue and expand this inflow of foreign labor. And again in 2007, then Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew, what did he say? I don't think we should turn on and off the tap. The tap for foreign labor. Because if you do that, you're sending the wrong signals to people, and it's very difficult to get the flow going again. So the government has always been very conscious of how it controls the inflow of foreign labor, but it doesn't want to be seen as too draconian on either side, right? Either too liberal or too conservative. Because if your policy is seen as inconsistent and unstable, it doesn't bode well for long-term planning for companies. In 2001, the Ministry of Trade and Industry did a study, which was quite widely reported at that time. It estimated that 41% of Singapore's GDP, gross domestic product, 41% of the GDP in the whole of the 1990s was contributed by foreign labor. Right? That means for every foreign worker was contributing 40% to our growth. In particular, those on employment passes, that means those with more skills, higher skills and earning more, basically earning higher wages, contributed 37%. All right. This is very significant. And they concluded basically that without the influx of foreign talent to replenish this shortfall in the indigenous Singapore labor force, injecting expertise, skills, and experience, the level of domestic factor inputs would have been insufficient to generate this kind of rapid growth.